Area News Group. Welcome to the Candidate Forum featuring a discussion on housing with California State Senate 15 candidates Dave Cortese and Ann Ravel. This hour-long conversation is part of a series sponsored by the Silicon Valley at Home Action Fund and California YIMBY. And thanks for all their work putting this together. The 15th district includes San Jose, Campbell, Cupertino, Los Gatos, and Saratoga, communities that present many different housing challenges for local and state leaders. Our two Democratic candidates tonight have deep roots in the district. Dave Cortese is a San Jose native and Bellarmine Prep alum. Cortese has served as a trustee for the East Side Union High School District and later spent 8 years on San Jose City Council. He was first elected to the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors in 2008 and has twice won re-election. He chairs the Housing, Land Use, and Environment Committee for the board. Cortese is a lawyer and father of 4. Ann Ravel was brought to San Jose by her parents when she was 11 years old. She worked her way through UC Berkeley and Hastings Law School. Her public career includes serving as Santa Clara County Council for 11 years. She has been appointed by Governor Jerry Brown and President Barack Obama to lead oversight agencies and served on the Federal Election Commission. Ann and her husband are residents of Los Gatos, where they raised their 3 children. Candidates tonight will have 1 or 2 minutes for answers to these housing questions. We'll also have a lightning round and take audience questions for the final 15-minute segment. So let's begin with Ann Ravel. California faces many housing questions and challenges. One of them is production. The production of new housing has been about half the rate it needs to meet its economic and population growth, according to certain studies. In January, Governor Gavin Newsom declared 2020 as the year of housing. It didn't turn out that way, obviously because of COVID-19. Few housing bills of any consequence made it to the governor's desk, but senators will have another chance at it in 2021. If you're elected, will you commit to making housing a priority next year? And if so, how?
I absolutely will make it a priority. I think it is one of our biggest needs. I, in particular, care about affordable housing rather than just looking at it as a housing issue. So particularly for me, the bill that was introduced this session relating to duplexes, I think it was a really good idea. I would have voted for that in a moment, and I will certainly introduce it again if necessary when I'm senator. I also think that we have to look at excess land that's not being utilized by the county in particular. Cities don't have so much, but the county has a lot, and instead they're using it for parking lots and the like. And so I would change the law relating to excess land to make it more prescriptive. And I also think that there is a way to incentivize housing, not just by the land, but also by potentially having some of the tax increment money so that it is not additional taxes, too many taxes already, but tax increment money that would be utilized to be able to fund some of the housing that we need. So all of those things are things that I would all push for. And I already did push for the tax increment housing with the governor. And I know that he would be willing to not veto it this time and take a look at using that as a mechanism for funding housing. So any of the things that need to be done in this area and in the state of California in general to incentivize housing, but also to make sure that it is in areas where of need everywhere so that it's actually something that creates equity in our community.
Thanks, Ann. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Lou, and thank you for the earlier introduction. I think, you know, the bill that is probably can do the most at the state level, it was SB 5, Jim Bell's legislation. It became SB 795 in the last session. It didn't make it to the governor's desk, and I think, you know, part of this job representing SD 15, Senate District 15, is going to be to really represent Jim Bell's legacy as somebody who's been able to move statewide legislation in terms of infrastructure and with a focus on transportation, but also housing. So SB 95, I want to pick that up and move that as the next senator for the district. Senator Bell endorsed me in this race, so I'm his choice, to pick up where he left off. And what that'll do, 795, is it'll create a statewide housing finance agency, and he's gone about it differently now than what he did before. He by his own admission, learned somewhat from his prior approach, which really went headlong into a conflict with school funding, and said, look, we can do this with general fund dollars. And not only can we do it with general fund dollars, and focus on housing, but we can put an increasing increment in for climate change to attack the climate problem. Two issues that I've been campaigning on during this entire campaign: housing production and dealing with this climate crisis. And we have to remember during the pandemic, where a lot of things have been overshadowed, literally and figuratively, that we came into this whole period of shelter in place with a housing crisis, with a homelessness crisis in the state. That's not just something local. And also with a climate crisis that isn't local, that's global. And those are areas where I want to lead. I was instrumental in standing up a housing finance agency in the region, and you'll hear more about that later.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dave. There's been a lot of, and we'll stick with you with this next question. There's been a lot of ways to try to fund the development of more affordable housing and address homelessness. Some of those include recreating redevelopment agencies, reforming mortgage interest deductions, and more statewide low-income housing tax credits. What policies would you support to bring more funding for homelessness prevention and affordable housing when we're talking about the most vulnerable residents?
Right. Well, production is key. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity at any point during this discussion to talk, in any depth about, the idea of getting secondary units not only streamlined, but into production rapidly. That's probably the quickest way to, double down on housing quickly, and do it in a way where you're not trying to create monster homes for people who can't afford them. You're creating affordable units, secondary units, ADUs as we call them. We've streamlined that in Santa Clara County. The city has streamlined it, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done at the state level, to really make that a ministerial process that moves quickly. And frankly, it's been, in a lot of cases, planning departments and building departments that have not liked it, and they've, got hung up on environmental review and design guidelines and all the things that they like to do. We need to get around that. We need to fix that. In terms of, again, focusing on housing production, I talked about the Housing Finance Agency. Tax incentives, you kind of alluded to, are, a huge tool that really hasn't been used in any significant level for a couple decades here. If you go back and look at the production of affordable housing, HUD-insured housing, garden variety apartment projects that people can afford to live in here, even in this valley, you'll see the production drop off dramatically about 2 decades ago when all the tax credits went away for doing that kind of work. And we need to get back to that. You don't have to pass a revenue measure, to give somebody a tax credit for doing timely production of housing that we desperately need right now. And lastly, I would just say as I close, what we did here in 2016 with Measure A, the largest bond any county passed in the state, that needs to be done on a statewide level, so you have money for extremely low income housing, permanent housing for the homeless, and that'll be a priority for me.
Thanks. Anne?
Well, let me first say that, of course, Measure A didn't involve any county money. It was taxpayer money. So it wasn't public money or other mechanisms of that. So yes, that has done some really good work, but that's not what we need to do now. We cannot keep raising taxes on people. I was a supporter of Measure E in the city of San Jose and did a lot of work for them and walked precincts for them, but it was a small tax increase for the homeless that was really necessary. I think we really do have to look at incentive programs, fee waivers, go to private funds, spend a lot more energy trying to have interactions not only with the city, county, and state, but also to work with corporations and have them have more responsibility for some of the ethical issues in our community that relate to homelessness and the housing problems. And we also have to go to foundations and other revenue, which I think should come from the sale of public land that goes back to the excess land issue that the county has been holding on to and has been unwilling to use their own resources to do what we need to do. And especially now, since we are going into what is another recession, and people are, there's going to be more homeless, there's going to be more people unemployed, housing is unaffordable, and we really need to work at creative ways of getting the homeless into housing. I firmly believe that we should have a housing first approach and make sure that we provide it to everybody.
Thanks, Ann. Let me stick with you for this next question. We've talked about a little bit about affordable housing and homelessness. I think we'll get back to that in a bit. Wanted to talk, the Senate District 15 has a lot of suburban areas, and some of them have been resistant to change in housing, and we've seen some of those fights play its way out in the courts and in the media. What about bringing increased housing density around transit areas in order to meet housing and climate goals? Senator Wiener brought SB 50 to help reform local zoning and bring a little bit more control back to the state. Would you support that type of transit-oriented development, and why or why not?
Right. I do support transit-oriented development as long as the transit is defined, for one thing. So those were some of the problems that I had with SB 50. That and the job centers lacked clarity, and also initially, of course, there was so much prescriptive requirements for every community, which I think you cannot have. You just cannot have. But absolutely, every community needs to have an obligation that fits with their community, and around transit is the place to do it. There is no question that I would support that, and I would support, depending, on heights and the like. But certainly, as I said, I think you can also build housing that is good for people, that includes, and obviously ADUs were mentioned, but ADUs could be throughout those communities and not just transit oriented. But of course, transit oriented is the best, so that so people are able to access the transit, assuming we had a decent transit system, which we don't. But it helps the environment, and it also helps people to get to jobs, which would be a really good thing. So without any question, I am firmly a believer, though, since I am a strong democracy person, that people should be able to discuss at least appearance or other aspects. People should weigh in, not that they preclude it. The state should require it, but the people in every community should be able to meet. There should be open meetings, have a voice.
Yeah. So did SB 50 go too far for you as far as taking local control?
It did.
Okay. Thanks. Dave?
Yeah, I don't really agree with the fact that SB 50 ultimately took away local control. I think if you read it, it's pretty clear right from the get-go that one of the first things it talks about, at least in the amended version, was subject to local zoning of, you know, the local government, the local county, or the local city.
Mm-hmm.
So what Senator Wiener is trying to do, and I understand that, and I had the opportunity to talk to him to make sure that he was making the right amendments. Somebody I served with on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission at the regional level, and I saw him day in and day out fighting to make sure that regional housing needs numbers, housing element numbers that cities were committing to, but not actually building, had some teeth. You know, if you say you're going to build it, if your general plan says you're going to build it, if your zoning says you're going to build it, and a developer comes along and says, fine, I want to build it, then let them build it. Don't bottleneck it, don't obstruct things. And, you know, and then I think he went further and tried to streamline the process for those cities and counties that actually, you know, want to do that and wanted to make the process move along more quickly, which when you're in a crisis is exactly what you want to do. So I went to the Board of Supervisors, what would be in our primary cycle of this election, just for context, because the bill was, as amended, was pending then, and we asked for further amendments. He made those amendments, and our board agreed to support SB 50. But you know, Senator Wiener is an environmentalist. He's looking at the fact that we've got 157,000 in-commutes from the Central Valley, from places like Los Banos and over the Altamont coming into this valley in non-COVID times.
Super commuters.
Commuters, which is tailpipe emissions. Housing built close to jobs, and I agree with him on that. And I also supported BART's ability to build housing on their sites, to answer your other question.
Thank you. You know, this is sort of a general question. You know, building homes in the Bay Area is very complex, and it takes years from acquiring land and financing, and then winning community support and city approval. You know, a prime example of this is the redevelopment of Valco Mall. Would you streamline the development process, and how would you do that?
Who are you asking first?
I'm sorry, this goes to Dave first.
I think it's important where you have consistent general plan and zoning to make sure that you're streamlining the process thereafter, meaning nobody wants to take, well, nobody here in my seat wants to take away design guidelines, a community process, the public hearing process, the general plan process has to be intact. But you know, obstructionism, once somebody comes along and says, I've met those requirements, you know, what you have in your general plan, what you have in your zoning has been met. I have the housing, or I have the housing in the retail, which, you know, I think goes back to the Valco example. Can we build it? There shouldn't be artificial barriers to that. There shouldn't be abuse of the CEQA process, litigation that's designed really to stop any kind of development. I think, you know, all communities need to realize that we have a housing crisis and that something has to happen. Now, the community should be involved every step of the way, just like when I represented my district as a city council member, every step of the way in the process of helping determine what that looks like. But once you make that determination, it's time to build, not to just stop. And I think what should have happened at Valco is there should have been a community process that brought people in early. It should have had the developers and rank and file community members sitting around the table. It should have been facilitated by the local officials. The politicians themselves, the public officials, the elected, should have been there facing the music and listening all the way along and tweaking that plan to arrive at consensus. And that's really been my calling card over the years. I'm somebody that looks first to build consensus, and I think I've been pretty successful at it over the years. I believe in it. You know, whether it's building new high schools or whether it's building housing production or it's revamping a shopping center, I've been able to get buy-in when it comes to land use, and that's what's really needed.
Anne, if you became a senator, what would you do to the entitlement process from a state level, and would you be interested in streamlining some of the process?
There's no question that many local entities have really complicated zoning. It isn't that I disagree with some of the local control, but I do have concerns about the difficulties for many to go through the planning departments, to get the permitting, to go through that. And you described the process as being very long. And I think zoning needs to be simplified without any question. The permitting process should be digitized. With respect to some of the other impediments, CEQA, in my opinion, needs to be not revamped from the environmental standpoint, because I agree with the law, but we know that CEQA has been utilized by many to be an impediment to building. And what needs to be done, in my opinion, is kind of like the EEOC or the local other civil rights violation agencies. There should be a state agency. People cannot litigate until they submit their concerns about what the violations of CEQA to the state agency, who would determine whether or not it is a valid environmental concern under the act, or if it's just being done to stop the development. And at that point, the agency would decide whether there's a right to sue or not. And if there isn't, then it ends the process, and that would speed it up considerably, because CEQA, we know, has been utilized by many to just hold up development. So yes, my answer to you is yes.
Yeah. Well, let's take another minute and give both of you a chance to expand a little bit on CEQA. It sounds like, Anne, that you would like to have another process to sort of be able to vet these CEQA violation questions.
Yes, most definitely, because what's being done now, and I saw it when I was county council, and I've seen it in other places, litigation is being used to hold up developments for years. And often that litigation is for other reasons. It has nothing to do with the actual issue of environmental impact of those developments. In fact, there are pretexts that are being utilized. And so I think it's important to have an agency that is committed to the CEQA law, which I believe in wholeheartedly and needs to be enforced, but will look at these other potential claims for what they are, and not allow it to impair the ability to create the housing that we need in this valley.
Great. Dave, would you like to respond on CEQA and reforming it?
Yeah, let me try to be as specific as possible in a minute here. First of all,
sure.
it is well within the legislature's purview to expedite the litigation process when it comes to CEQA, and that's been done once. They didn't go far enough. It's something you may be aware of as a journalist is done with election law. We saw it with Bush Gore at the end with the whole hanging Chad issue in Florida and everything else. That went right up the ladder. It got litigated quickly, and got to the Supreme Court quickly, relatively speaking, compared to a CEQA suit that lasts for 3 or 4 or 5 years. You can do that with CEQA at the state level, and we should do that, and we should do it right away. Secondly, governments, this isn't something you hear talked about very much. I found it to be a problem when I got to the county. I found it to be a problem at the city to some extent when I was there in San Jose. You can't have government bottlenecking the process either. I had one planning director tell me at one point in time, I'm the only person in this department that's qualified to read a CEQA document that's over 300 pages. That can't happen. So we need statutes that put time requirements on how long a local government can sit on an EIR report and not read it. They need to turn those around and not hold developers up from moving forward. It
sounds like you would have to hire a lot more planners to do that.
Yeah.
that can be costly.
You can't move housing production along and not have a planning department that can keep up with the pace. So that's going to be part of what has to be done. Absolutely.
Sure.
They could still hold it up through that process. It could be held up longer.
Yeah. Okay, so I believe we stay with Dave. I think we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We are in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and this health crisis has put a lot of stress on renters and landlords and that whole system. We have a very high percentage relative to the rest of the country as far as renters are concerned in our communities. Governor Newsom recently signed Assembly Bill 3088, and that's the COVID-19 Tenant Relief Act. It gives some protections for tenants and landlords, but the critics say it doesn't offer enough protections, particularly for tenants. And it also preempts some local eviction moratoriums. The lawmakers have said that it's even a short-term fix. As a senator in 2021, you're going to have to address this again. What do you see as far as trying to fashion a long-term fix that helps tenants and landlords hurt by the pandemic?
Yeah, you're starting with me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. You know, as a member of the Board of Supervisors, I've had the opportunity multiple times now to vote on, create, and extend, an eviction moratorium, putting a stop to it during COVID for businesses and for residential purposes. And of course, that's been enabled by state law. And the law that you were just mentioning allows local governments to do that a bit longer, but then it all sort of comes to an end here. And I think that's where critics are concerned. We don't know, unfortunately, when we get a vaccine. That's the answer to all of this. And I don't think anyone thought we were going to be tied up with this pandemic this long. So what's the likelihood that people who are behind on the rent right now are suddenly going to be caught up and everything's going to be hunky-dory here in terms of people's ability to pay 2 months from now, or what the statutory deadline is. And it does prohibit local governments from just doing it on their own. The biggest issue that we have that's going to have to be addressed, and I think is going to continue to need federal help in terms of stimulus dollars, is a recent study that was done here in Silicon Valley indicated that as of June, there were already about 50,000 people, residential tenants, behind on their rent. And that's we're now in September. And you got to believe a lot of those folks are in worse shape now. It's certainly not caught up. So it's going to take, I think, a combination of things. I think we need a change at the top in terms of the President of the United States, so we can, and the U.S. Senate, so we can get a stimulus package that actually addresses rent relief for tenants and for businesses and for landlords, let's face it. And we're probably going to need that on the mortgage side as well. But in the meantime, I think state and local government are going to have to set up, as best they can, continued safety net efforts. I think this eviction ordinance this law at the state level will ultimately have to be extended. And it'll probably be extended when I'm there, and I'll support that.
Anne.
Well, I think my answer is somewhat similar in the sense that there is no question that the extension that the legislature gave and the governor signed is not sufficient. We know that it's not going to be sufficient. And so no question needs to be extended. We do not want to have people losing their homes, renters being kicked out and not being able to have a place to live. I mean, having a place to live is so essential that we've got to find ways to do it. And I do think that there will have to be financial assistance to renters, and agree that it would probably be something that the state could do for a little bit longer, but we also have to give financial assistance to the landlords as well, because they cannot, especially small landlords, it's going to be very difficult for them to continue in providing free rent to people for a long period of time, even the small amount of percentage of the rent that the bill spoke to. So this is really something that we are going to need to be providing to people as long as it's needed. I also think we have to, personally, I feel that we have to protect renters from any kind of retaliatory evictions. And I would provide legal services from the state or local that would be free legal services, so people would be able to be protected from that. But ultimately, it is true that hopefully the federal government, and I know I'm doing some work with the Biden transition team, this is something that Biden has definitely agreed that he would do should he be elected. So
Sure.
something that I think is really important for us to do.
Yeah. Well, let's go another minute on this. And let me follow up on something that you said. If you did get more federal funding, where would you focus it? What types of landlords? What types of tenants? And would there be other supportive services that you would spend on? What priorities would you have?
Well, first off, we know that issues of affordable housing and the failures of our housing markets, including rental housing, are disproportionate, and that the communities of color in Santa Clara County too are affected the most by this. And so certainly that would be one place that I would want to emphasize help for, because while all low-income people will need assistance, no question about it, that is where the issues are exacerbated. So certainly that's where I would put the first priorities. And also with regard to what kind of places, I don't think that you can limit it to, like, people say mom and pop, and it's in the bill about mom and pop and small landlords. I mean, obviously we don't want large corporations that are running apartment buildings that are gigantic and fancy, like some of the ones that have been built around here. They probably don't have that same need to be augmented, but I think we should expand it to people that are renting to even small apartment buildings.
Sure. Dave?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a scale much similar to what we do, with affordable housing now, that's based on area median and income, that scale the amount of help based on extremely low income, for example, very low income, moderate income, and people who really don't have an affordability problem in terms of their rent, I think have to, by nature, in most cases, be last in line. And the reason for that is the magnitude of it. I just want to re-emphasize that one more time. If you have 50,000 people who were behind on their rent in June, and let's just say rent averages $2,000, which is about $1,000, $500 to $1,000 less probably than median rent right now. But let's say it's $2,000. That's $100 million in back rent just for June, just in this county alone. It's now September. Where are we at? $250 million in terms of backlog. I'm not sure we get $250 million here in Santa Clara County at all, let alone for a 3-month period from the federal government. So I don't want to scare anyone, but it's a great question, and it's something that I'm going to need to lead on in the state Senate. It's something I'm going to have to continue leading on here in the county of Santa Clara to protect people. Because it's of an order of magnitude that there is no quick fix for. It's enough to bankrupt a county or a city if they wade in and try to do that rent relief themselves. It's a huge number, and there's no reassurance that we're going to get that help from the federal government. I did at the county level just asked the board, and they approved it, to go in and convert our neighborhood mediation program into a tenant assistance program to bring landlords and tenants in, because they can freely contract to modify their arrangement and defer rent and set up a new agreement, do a lease extension. Sure. They're going to need help with that.
And the new law seeks to encourage that as well.
Yes.
You know, Anne touched on this in her last answer a little bit about how the pandemic has hit communities of color much harder than other communities in the Valley and in California. There is a question of racial equity when it comes to housing policy. A recent UC Berkeley report found that higher levels of single-family exclusive zoning were associated with greater racial segregation. These researchers also found that Senate District 15 was one of the most intensely segregated census tracts in the county. There are a couple of bills, and we touched on them before, that could have addressed this. Senate Bill 902, which allows cities to more quickly change zoning to accommodate small apartment buildings, and SB 1120, allowing duplexes and lot splitting. They didn't move forward. As senator, would you endorse these, and would you support these? And I believe it's Dave's turn. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay. I didn't mean to intercede there. Anyway, SB 902, you know, I've looked at it. It seems very supportable to me. It seems largely, by and large, on the right track. Again, to use some terminology I think I used earlier, to try to say, look, we can make secondary units. We can make certain kinds of housing proposals that are consistent with local law, local zoning ordinances. We can make them ministerial. We can move them quickly. And that's important. And it's also important, it's kind of a right sizing issue to some degree. If you have, the reason you have a tale of two cities and you have overrepresentation of people of color in terms of high impact and negative categories, if you will, including COVID itself, is because people historically, people of color, including in this valley, have been pushed down, they're working 2 or 3 jobs in some cases. They are in much of my zip code, and they're exposed to disease. They don't have the kind of accrued wealth to allow them to step up and afford housing in this environment. So yeah, we need that. The other bill you talked about was not 902. Can you give me the number?
Sure. It was 1120. It was the President Pro Tem's bill about lot splitting in duplexes, making it easier.
I think that bill needs to be amended, and it would be, you know, really good if what she mentions in there, that demolition can occur of a single family home in exchange for a lot split. I don't think you need lot splits or demolition to proceed with ADUs. What I think you need is fast tracking of ADUs on lots that are already large enough to house a secondary unit. So I would actually amend the bill to say that the Subdivision Map Act is amended so that you don't need a lot split to put a secondary unit on a single family lot. That would move a lot of things. That would move the chains immediately. And I think she kind of went about it a little backwards, but I think it's very fixable. And I look forward to working on it when I get there.
Thanks. Anne.
So the issue of racial injustice is really important, I think, in discussing housing. And particularly here, as you mentioned, because it's so clearly never been addressed in our community. And that is a really big problem because it affects the education system, it affects living wage jobs, it affects everything, and the ability to get safe housing and poor health outcomes. So I think that this is something that is really important to do. With regard to 1120, had I been there, I would have supported it, but I do think that it would be better only because, for example, with ADUs, it's not a developer entitlement thing. It is, instead of giving all the money to the developers that the county has given money to build housing, you give money for the landowners, and they have the way of getting the income from it. And it's a much better way to do it. And so 1120 would work out that way, if assuming that the lots are big enough for the homeowner to be able to split it in a sense, or not split it and just put another duplex on it. And I know there's plenty of lots that are big enough for that sort of thing if they choose to do so. And like ADUs, it helps the economy by getting more low-income people to be able to find housing in our community. So I definitely support it. I think 902, the sizing is an issue, and it would have to, you'd have to look at it depending on where the community is and where they intend to have it. So I think that's the issue. But it's unfortunate that those bills did not pass when we have such a commitment to housing in this state, and is such a need for housing, that the legislature was unable to come together and devise bills that could meet everybody's needs and get jump started, because we need it now.
Yeah. A lot of disappointment from housing advocates. I just want to remind our watchers to submit questions for the candidates. We're going to have a Q&A section from our voters coming up. So submit them in the Q&A boxes, and we'll share those with our candidates. There is another following up on that theme of communities of color and their suffering as far as housing policy or the discrimination that comes in with some of these issues. During the last recession, the foreclosure crisis hit communities of color especially hard. We have growing wealth inequality in the state. Part of that derives from housing policy. Are there things that the state can do to prevent this from happening again? The foreclosures, the loss of equity, and the displacement.
Right. Are you talking to me?
Yes, Ann.
Well,
yes.
Thank you very much, because this is right up my alley, because the reason that I went to the Department of Justice was President Obama asked me to come to deal with the foreclosure crisis. And I did, in charge of consumer litigation, and dealt with the way that banks, and then what the banks did that was funneled down to all those poor homeowners, mostly people of color, but hundreds of thousands of them who lost their homes. Mm-hmm. And so absolutely, there are things that can be done on behalf of those individuals. I mean, clearly, what I did, of course, was to go against rating agencies and Wall Street companies. But of course, there's also all the other racist ways that people are kept out of homes that we know of. For example, the people who are assessing the people who want to buy houses and their capability for purchasing it and all the rest. And all those things need to be changed, and we can have laws that will prohibit that kind of behavior and also to deal with the mortgage industry and make sure that there aren't fraudulent mortgages or excessive, the ways that people tend to, when they're trying to refinance or do something so that they don't get evicted, don't lose their house. There needs to be due process, and we can assure that there is when people are trying to refinance and to deal with their loans so that they can meet their mortgage payments. So all of those things can be dealt with in a way that will prohibit the actions that are really inappropriate by mortgage companies in not giving time for people to be able to stay in their homes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
A priority.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't, I've never been, lived in Washington for a great length of time or been any kind of a Washington insider. I was right here helping people in local government, during the crisis that you're talking about. And, let's knock on wood and hope we get a vaccine as quickly as we can before we have, another complete downturn on the real estate side. Values in California have stayed up so far. But they've never been equitable or even for communities of color, and that's part of a larger institutional racism that has, as I said earlier, popped up in just about every negative indicator that we have. We have we have higher dropout rates among children of color in this state. We have overrepresentation in the justice system, both at the adult and the juvenile level. We have, in the accumulation of wealth, therefore, we have much more difficulty. We have, it's been, since the passage of Prop 209, even harder for students of color to get the education that they need to better themselves, so to speak, academically, to pull down the kind of jobs we have here in Silicon Valley, to either improve the homes that they're in and increase the value so they're not targets for investors that just come in and displace them, or to move into whatever neighborhood they want. That's the world that we want. And that's why I brought forward to the Board of Supervisors, and I think every county in the state should be doing this, a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis, because that's really how it ultimately shows up. Even the mortality rates among people of color ultimately are overrepresented relative to whites, for example. So it is literally something that's that in every vote, that I take as a state senator, I will evaluate the impact of that vote on institutional racism on people of color before I cast that vote.
Thank you for that. We have a few questions from the audience, but I think first let me go through a lightning round of questions. And if I can just get you to do a simple yes or no on these propositions and bills that are coming forward. And we'll start again with you, Dave. Do you support Prop 15, otherwise known as the Schools and Community First Act, which would reform Prop 13?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Anne?
No, now's not the time.
Sticking with you, Anne, do you support Prop 16, which repeals the state's anti-affirmative action ban, otherwise known as Prop 209?
Yes, I do, very strongly.
Dave?
Yes, I support Prop 16.
Do you support Prop 19, which would grant tax breaks for property owners who are victims of wildfires and natural disasters? Dave?
Leaning towards support. I'm still evaluating it, but it's likely I'll take a support position on that.
Okay. And Anne, Prop 19.
I think I would support it as well because, well, you only want yes or no, so yes.
Prop 21, which grants local jurisdictions greater flexibility to expand rent control. Anne?
No.
Yeah, I'm a no on 21 as well.
And one final proposition, Prop 22, which would eliminate employment classifications and benefits for Uber, Lyft, DoorDash drivers, and instead provide them with a minimum level of compensation and healthcare subsidies. Yes or no? Dave?
No.
Anne?
Yes.
Prop 22?
Yeah, yes, with a caveat, but.
With a caveat. We can tell we have really smart lawyers that I get to talk to tonight. I'm I'm happy with that. We have many questions from our audience, and let's jump into to some of these. And I think we'll have 1 minute each for this. And Anne, I'll start with you. Would you support sanctioned encampments to provide better conditions for vulnerable people living unhoused? And how would it be implemented? Homelessness question.
Yes, I do support sanctioned encampments if there are no alternatives. And let me just say, I would much prefer to house everybody. It would be my first aim if possible. But how it would be implemented would be, of course, to find land where you can, such as the land that the county used to refuse to give on the fairgrounds, and make sure that there's sanitation, abilities for those people to clean up, and maybe even provide services to them, which they need for addiction help or for mental illness. All of those things would be good things to have as part of the community for those people who would perhaps prefer to be in that kind of location rather than where they are now on the streets and going to jail. But that's not the best solution in my mind.
Yes, we need the whole continuum. We've done, I think, a great job in this county with Measure A on the permanent housing side. You know, the sanctioned encampment is at the other end of the continuum. It's one step out of a creek or an underpass, of course, and I supported and actually helped the homeless population move into the so-called Hope Village over on Rough Drive, which was not a suburban community. It was an area where there was some intermittent office space, some of it abandoned, some vacant lots, and the community lived there in a very stable fashion without any criminal incidents or any problems for some time until the city, who the county was leasing the land from, terminated the lease and they moved on. But it was an example that it can be done. If it's going to be done, it should be done in industrial areas, not in suburban areas. And it's not going to knock out the problem. We need mental health beds, and we need transitional housing that has dignity to it. That's the real answer.
Complex problem. Dave, we'll start again with you. We've seen multiple universities impacted, some permanently, by the COVID-19 epidemic. What measures would you take to ensure our UC and CSU systems, which are critical to our state and students, be kept intact? How do we protect these universities and college during COVID?
Well, they've got to be protected as the most essential infrastructure that we have in the state. I mean, we could telecommute and not use our highways and rail lines. You know, we can do a lot of different things to avoid the need for infrastructure, but our educational infrastructure has to be in place. I have 4 kids. The oldest is a school teacher, 2 boys, 2 girls. The youngest is a UC student right now. He's a little bit over 20 years old. So I know firsthand what the kids are going through. They're being denied right now the opportunity that pretty much all the rest of us had, you know, to have a college experience, to have a library to go to study, to have a routine that they follow, to have a professor standing before them, you know, teaching. And that's not something you can really substitute for. You know, distance learning is occasionally a good thing. It's not a good thing. And it doesn't replace the need for the bricks and mortar infrastructure that we have in our UC system. So I'll protect it at all costs, you know, given the constraints that we're up against.
So I presume that the question really is about how to make sure that our university system stays funded and stays available for all students. And frankly, the legislature has not prioritized either the UC system or the state college system. And what I think is also very important is the community college system, because we know there's going to be people out of jobs who are going to need to be retrained. And so both the community college system as well as schools that do training for people in the trades and the like are really important for us to be funding. And personally, I went to UC Berkeley, I went to Hastings Law School. I am a product of the UC system, and it is not being funded the way it should be funded to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to get ahead the way I was able to get ahead when I grew up here. And so for sure, that would be a big priority of mine for funding as well, because education is the way that we're going to get out of this recession that we're going to be in.
Mm-hmm. And back to you, Ann, and education is the next question as well. It's the largest budget item in the state, and many teachers are paid a low income. It's very difficult for to attract teachers at a time like this, and the Bay Area is a very expensive place for them to live. How would you address that problem?
Yeah, well, if what they're talking about is the housing issues, I understand that. I went to an event at the local Board of Education, and there were a lot of teachers who were living in cars and teaching in the local schools, which is scandalous. So it's partly because of the dearth of affordable housing here, but it's also because of the amount of money that people were making that was insufficient given the area. So for sure, we need to deal with the housing that's affordable for teachers. I mean, honestly, and others. So I have a plan that I think might help in school funding, because what I find to be an anomaly now is that the money that is given by Prop 98 and by, first off, property taxes and the discrepancies between low-income districts and those that are wealthier because of property tax.
Big discrepancies.
Yeah. Huge discrepancies, and it's wrong. It should be consistent. And because probably schools should have larger districts, honestly, instead of small districts that are causing great expense for people. But also, I believe that some of those costs, the large percentage of the cost goes in schools goes to teacher retirement. And frankly, I think that should be a state cost. It should be a direct pay to CalSTRS. And that money that is allocated to schools, because they get a lot of funding actually, but not enough, should be going directly to the students and the teachers. It shouldn't be going to retirement for those who've retired. That money should be allocated separately.
Sure. And Dave, you have a personal stake in this as well. We'll give you a little extra time. I think our clock slowed down a little bit there.
Yeah, I think it doubled down. So, thank you. I mean, education's been probably the real common thread in my, elected career, if you will. I mean, I didn't get on city council until I was 45 years old after an extensive business career and practicing law and so forth. But I did serve on the school board before that, Eastside Union, and I saw firsthand what it is like for the teachers on the first 5 years of the salary schedule, particularly difficult and oppressive to try to live on that kind of income. So, agreed, it's a huge problem. One of the things I've proposed, and I've tried to propose it even at the Board of Supervisors as some sort of relief, it should really be at the state level, is a teacher housing voucher program for the teachers on the first 5 years of the housing of the payroll. Those teachers that are making the least should have an opportunity, much like a veteran with a VASH voucher or a Section 8 voucher, to come in and at least have some relief until they work their way up the salary schedule. My wife is a school board member now, but she's also a substitute teacher in one of the poorest districts here in Santa Clara County, Elm Rock Union. What they get paid and the hours that they work is really is really unacceptable here in the United States of America. It's almost a form of volunteerism to work that hard for that little pay. So, you know, even just from a dignity and sort of a humanitarian standpoint, asking people to do some of the most important work on earth, to take care of our children, to teach our children, and, you know, to go home and continue working until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, prepping for the next day, and to pay them less than a living wage is unacceptable. We do need school funding equalization. I've taken a bus trip to Sacramento now for almost a dozen years, going back to when I was a city council member, and I was asked by my constituents to go to Sacramento and petition the governor's office for school funding equalization because districts that I represented were basic aid districts that were struggling. And I said, I'll go if you go with me. And now we take 5 busloads a year. We had to cancel this year because of COVID, but 5 busloads of people want to go on that trip so they can directly petition their legislators. And guess what their number one issue is? Equal treatment, funding equalization, and that teacher salary schedule on the first 5 years. So I'm there, I'm committed to it, and we'll figure out how to get it done.
Yeah, thanks. We have one last question here, and I want to thank our guests for joining us tonight. This last question is about the missing middle. How do we provide housing for middle-income households who don't qualify for low-income or inclusive housing and can't really afford the high rents? You know, when you look at the housing production numbers and goals, what's being built generally in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area are high-end homes, and we're reaching our goals at 100% of those. Low-end homes that are subsidized, not meeting our goals at all, but the middle section is really the part that's lagging. How do you address that? And Dave, you get to start this, and then we'll end up with Ann.
Yeah, I was on the regional task force that they called CASA, which was, you know, the Committee to Address Housing in the region last year, and it was a private-public task force with some of the top executives in the Bay Area involved, and we went over all of these issues regarding housing, but the missing middle that you're talking about came through loud and clear. And it's really a production issue when it comes right down to it. We talked about production earlier. You asked about that, Lou. And when you're creating jobs 6 to 1 over housing in the Bay Area, and have been over a long period of time, again, these are non-COVID numbers, you're going to have a problem with middle-income folks who are being hired for those jobs, not being able to afford rents that are based, rents or mortgages for that matter, that are based on pent-up demand. And you're going to have bidding wars for apartments and for housing, and that came through loud and clear. It needs to be addressed by the same production response that I gave you earlier, by housing finance that's spurred by tax incentives, by state and regional housing finance agencies that get that middle income market going again.
Yeah.
I think there's some additional things that can be done as well that would not only provide jobs, but it would also deal with the problems of the middle income who are unable to afford homes in this valley. And I would say, for example, that the state should enter into partnerships with those builders who are building modular homes and try to expand them so that they're not just like tiny homes. They're bigger, they're but less expensive to build on some of the land that the county, I'm sure, will be giving up. But I'm just joking, of course. And so there are ways that we can incentivize less expensive building in this state. And it would be able to help not only people get jobs, but also provide housing for people. And that's where it is true, what we need to do is provide more housing, but because the housing costs are so expensive, I know even in Los Gatos, some affordable housing, allegedly, that they are supposedly building in the North 40.
North 40.
Going to go for over $1 million. That is not affordable housing for middle income people. And so in my view, we need to figure out ways to incentivize builders and those who are trying to find ways to do less expensive building.
And address that. Yeah. If you'll indulge me, we have a couple of late questions that I think are pretty timely. If we have a few more minutes to touch on these, one addresses the wildfires. My goodness, what actions do we have to take to prevent and better prepare for these wildfires? Anne, you go first.
Yes. Well, of course, Governor Newsom said this was a priority and he was going to do a lot of work. And there has been a lot of work done to cut back on excess brush. And I know, because I live near there in the Santa Cruz Mountains, they've cut back a lot. They've done a lot of work. CAL FIRE did. They're amazing what they did in the winter to cut back some of the leaves and the trees, but it's not enough. There are so many acres, obviously. I mean, look, we had Bonnie Doon burned down. We had our, beautiful park burned to the ground. So I think what we have to do is invest in this more, because it's not going to change. Climate change is obviously here to stay, and it's not going to be a good thing for California. So we need to do that. We need to try to, and it's hard with PG&E with all those lines in rural areas, but we need to also, and they've tried to do a good job to stop the igniting of fires, and most of them this time did not come from power lines, but really we have to find ways ultimately in this state, and it's a very expensive proposition to try to get those underground, because otherwise the state is going to ignite the way it has been. This particular time period where it's just been devastating, and it has been, of course, for years, but we must have this as a priority. And I think that the solution that people care about, I know a lot of people say, well, we should change zoning and not let anybody purchase property or build in the mountains or in fire-prone areas. But we have so many fire-prone areas in this state.
Sure.
And I think that's going to be a no-go, honestly. So we've got to do the hard work.
Dave, how do we work on this issue of wildfires? How do we prevent these? How does the state deal with them better?
Yeah, it's something, for better or worse, I've had firsthand experience with recently. We had the second largest wildfire in the state, called the SCU fire, in Santa Clara County, of course, in Alameda, and it went all the way down to Highway 152. Almost half of that fire was in my supervisorial district in the Oak Chaparral lands here, right above the Elm Rock foothills. It started in Milpitas, of course, and again went all the way down to Highway 152. There were not enough resources available to CAL FIRE and the mutual aid agencies. That's one thing that we have to absolutely make sure we have in this era of climate change, combined with years of drought that we get. And then I've lived here all my life. I came from a farming background. I will tell you, we don't have lightning strikes in August here in Northern California in the driest part of the year. That's new. That is a function, I believe, of the climate crisis. And of course, we have to address that as a crisis, just like we're dealing with the pandemic as a crisis, and not put it off as somebody else's business. So we need resources. There are some management techniques that can be approved and can be unified across the state. And some of that, it just is further communication and cooperation between the various agencies that that all have to come together and fight these fires. They know it. They preach it all the time. Clear language about boundaries, about who's really first responder and who's mutual aid. All of that should be in a statewide wildfire management plan that lays everything out, that has the full cooperation of our fire agencies and our firefighters. And it's something I've been talking about with them all along. My house was in a fire evacuation area here in my supervisorial district, and I'm proud to be endorsed by the firefighters and basically every fire agency that endorses in this race. And people can go to my website if they want to see that, or education endorsements or anything else.
Lou, can I add one thing? There was a bill proposed in the legislature in this term, but it did not get passed by the legislature amid infighting. But it was to add a certain amount of money onto utility bills to be able to find storage for renewable energy, but also thinning trees and vegetation. And I think that there were parts of that bill that I think people objected to, consumer groups and the like, but it seems that something along those lines that could be altered some is what I would propose to help to assure that we have more of this done throughout the state.
Dave, I'll give you a last word on that. Would more state funds or an additional fee be a help to the state preventing future or damaging wildfires?
Yeah, we know there's more than one bill that talked about moving revenue around and making some available for fire, and that's going to have to be done. Revenue is going to be scarce. The state's facing a $54 billion deficit, but these are life and death issues. Response time obviously can be a life and death issue. Having cell communication ability that's mobile during fires when cell phone towers go down, all that technology, those tools are available. Having enough tankers, they did not have enough converted B-52s to deal with both SCU and the Santa Cruz fire here. They had to pull them out of one side of the valley for a couple of days and bring them to the other side. And I admire them for making that work somehow and minimizing damage. It's great firefighters, but they shouldn't be under-resourced like that. And we'll figure out where to move money around and get it to them.
Well, thanks for weighing in on this. Very, very topical and outside of everyone's doors and on top of everyone's minds these days. I want to thank Supervisor Dave Cortese, Commissioner Ann Ravel, for being here tonight, talking and sharing their expertise and ideas about the housing crisis that we face in the Bay Area. And these two candidates for the 15th Senate District will be appearing near you, I'm sure, in other Zooms and campaign appearances. So best of luck to you both as the campaign winds into its final months. I want to say thank you to, again, SV at Home Action Fund and California YIMBY for hosting this event. We also have a number of co-hosts: the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Tech Equity Collaborative, Adobe Services, EAH Housing, First Community Housing, Mid-Penn Housing, Asian Law Alliance, Home First, Destination Home, African American Community Services Agency of San Jose, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women of Silicon Valley, and many, 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 many more. They are really a lot of dedicated folks here focusing on the issues of housing and the housing crisis that we face in the Bay Area. A very special thanks also to the excellent work of Mario Lopez for pulling all this together this week, and look for other forums for other candidates. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Lou Hansen from the Bay Area News Group. Remember to support local news. Good night.
Thank you, Lou.
Great job, Lou.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.